Welcome back, everybody here in the room and also participants online. We're starting the first of the academic sessions, and it's really my privilege to be chairing this. I'm very excited about this. My name is Volker Schimmel. I am the head of UNHCR's Global Data Service. We are a headquarters team supporting a registration, statistical, information management work through our bureaus and country offices in 130 plus places around the globe. And we are very excited to be participating in this conference. With that, also thanks to the JDC for putting together yet another unique event that straddles research and practice. And I'm particularly grateful that I can look at something that also historically for me has been a big element, which is the dimension of economic well-being, livelihoods, and the context of forced displacement. Before diving into the topic and introducing the panel, I just wanted to quickly mention that we have 3 presentations here, 1 in the room, 2 online. They will last for about 20 minutes. And then we have a chance to collect a few questions from you here in the room, as well as with the help of Dominic over there from the online participants. And we'll take a quick moment after each presentation to answer those. And that we do 3 times, and that should bring us to the end of this particular round. So before opening the session, let me introduce to you who will be presenting. We have here to my right and in the room, Thomas Ginn from the Center for Global Development. Thomas is a research fellow at the center and focuses on migration and displacement. His current research focus is on aid in lower income countries, including projects on labor market access, housing, and host community attitudes. And we will be hearing precisely on these topics in the presentation. Prior to joining the center, Thomas worked with the World Bank on the survey of Syrian refugees in Lebanon, Jordan, and Iraqi Kurdistan, and with Innovations for Poverty Action in Kenya. He holds a PhD in economics from Stanford University, and his dissertation evaluated camps for Syrian refugees, and is also a BA holder from the University of North Carolina. To our first online presenter, we have Maria Jose Silva-Vargas. She's with the Abdulatif Jamil Poverty Action Lab, or JPAL for short. Maria Jose works as a research and policy manager at JPAL Europe. In this role, she anchors the office's partnership with the Luxembourg Institute for Socioeconomic Research, and as well as through the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Luxembourg and LuxDev. She also provides support to development actors, helping them to apply and generate evidence that informs development policy. Maria Jose obtained her PhD at the School of Business and Economics at Maastricht, and she was the Robert S. McNamara Fellow at the Dime World Bank in 21 and 22. And she has also had several visiting periods with the IIES in Stockholm and the GPRL at Northwestern. Maria Jose has worked in Uganda and Tanzania, managing impact evaluations on gender, labor markets, and governance for the World Bank and Innovations for Poverty Action. And it's in this, and there is a previous research study link to Côte d'Ivoire as well. And we will be hearing about specifically the regional focus and the economic dimension in her presentation. Lastly, it's my pleasure to introduce Tara Mitchell from the Trinity College Dublin. Tara is an assistant professor at the Department of Economics. She also is a consultant for the World Bank and a founding member of the Trinity Impact Evaluation Unit, or TIME for short. Her main research areas are development economics, focusing on questions related to applied microeconomics. Secondary research areas are agricultural economics and economics of information. Tara is a PhD holder from the London School of Economics, and in 2019 was awarded the Provost Teaching Award in recognition of outstanding contribution to the support of teaching excellence. Welcome to the three presenters, and I will be very brief in opening the session. As you saw from the agenda, we have a topic around micro-entrepreneurs, around mentorship and capacity building, all in the context of socioeconomic well-being and livelihoods. And of course, this is a topic of continued relevance for all of us working in this space, but of course in recent years also has risen really globally to the area of attention, certainly in the Northern and Western Hemisphere, but in many countries where you all work as well. So we of course are looking at refugee participation and livelihoods and sustainability thereof. We had many comments to that effect and observations, including personal ones from the opening sessions already. But the one topic that is not necessarily in the headline, and really the session is more than meets the eye, is about social cohesion. And we'll be hearing from all of them, not just about the economic aspect, but also the social / social cohesion aspect, which is particularly interesting. We will be looking at 2 studies from Uganda, one from Niger, and we will have a nice opportunity to also connect those across, and hopefully we'll have a very engaging session thanks to your contributions and questions. With that, I hand over to Thomas for the first presentation. Thomas, please go ahead.
There we go. Can you hear me? Fantastic. Thank you so much. Thank you, Volker, for a fantastic introduction. To the organizers for this fantastic conference, it's an absolute pleasure and honor to be here. My name is Thomas Ginn. I'm a researcher at the Center for Global Development, and I'll be presenting joint work with Travis Bosler at Rochester, Ibrahim Kassire at the Economic Policy Research Center in Kampala, Belinda Moya, who's with our implementing partner at the International Rescue Committee, and Andy Zeitlin at Georgetown University. And so we're going to kick off the research portion here with a project that touches on a lot of things that came up earlier on long-term displacement, on livelihoods, on social cohesion, as Volker said, with some expected important results, as well as some unexpected findings that we're excited to share. Oh, there we go. Takes a second. Fantastic. So micro-entrepreneurship, think small businesses, small entrepreneurs, oftentimes informal, is common across low and middle income countries, but yields quite low profit for many people around the world. And so this is obviously a large area of development economics. There have been plenty of studies looking at what are the constraints these businesses face and how can we see them grow. And so researchers have identified both financial and managerial capital, right, as some of the constraints. So cash interventions, we've seen can make major differences in the lives of these entrepreneurs, often have positive, strong effects, but we've seen that sometimes these effects are lower for women and don't necessarily persist. We've also seen to target managerial capital, we've seen business training interventions that maybe have some positive impacts, but they're often quite expensive. And so how to deliver these is a key question. In addition, we have little evidence on how these programs affect refugees in comparison to hosts in the same context. And so in order to address a lot of these constraints, we're going to design a program with the IRC that's going to focus on mentorship by a more experienced business owner. And we think that this mentorship could target a couple things: business practices, networks, even just encouragement to business owners that are getting started, and then facilitate knowledge exchange that we all know is important for many things, but maybe especially important across different demographics that have sort of less contact with each other. So in this context, think refugees and hosts, or maybe even men and women, where exchange and returns to this cooperation might be especially high, and that this might be cheaper to deliver than your standard business training that's delivered formally. So this is going to be in the context of the Rebuild program in Kampala, Uganda. And so this is going to be a randomized trial. And the reason that we randomize is because we're hoping that in large groups that when we randomly assign different programs, that it's going to balance the different groups on both outcomes that we can observe and things that we can't observe beforehand. And so that then when we see after the fact the differences in these two groups, we hope that we can causally attribute those differences to this program in particular. And so that's a favorite of researchers to identify the effects of programs. So this is going to be a randomized trial in the capital city of Kampala. We're going to be working with Ugandans and refugees. So Ugandans are the hosts in this context, and men and women, sort of an even sample of all of these different groups. And then we're going to have 2,000 inexperienced or prospective entrepreneurs under the age of 35. And then we're going to also recruit 600 entrepreneurs in this context with at least 4 years of experience who are a little bit older, both, again, refugees and hosts, women and men. And then we're going to see the effects of bringing these people together into business groups, mentorship groups. So the kind of basis of the interventions is going to be a large cash grant. So this is $540 that everyone in the treatment groups is going to get. And then the mentorship component is going to be 3 mentees and then 1 mentor. And we ask them to meet weekly for 6 months. And so within these mentor groups, we're going to vary the gender and the nationality compositions of these different groups to see, comparing groups that are all Ugandans to groups that are partially Ugandans and partially refugees, and how that matters for both economic and social outcomes. We're also going to vary individual level incentives and then group level incentives to see if some group level incentives might be able to overcome some of the initial maybe social distance that people have when they're joining a mixed mentorship group. We're going to measure these both economic and social outcomes before the program starts at baseline, and then at 3, 6, 9, and then 12 months later, so to try to see sort of the dynamics of how the intervention plays out. And so to give a sneak preview here, we're going to find really large, exciting, positive effects from cash, both on the economic outcomes, but also on the social cohesion outcomes. But then when we look at mentorship across the board, largely we see sort of minimal effects at best and some sort of variation within that. So I'll dive right in. So a little bit of background in case this audience isn't aware that Uganda is one of the most progressive hosting countries around the world, with the right to work and freedom of movement extended to the 1.6 million refugees who live there. So about 150,000 of these refugees live in the capital city, Kampala. And so then with the IRC, we're going to be recruiting both refugees and hosts who want to start businesses or who already have small businesses. And so then within our sample, 70% of these folks have businesses at baseline. And it's not that the refugees are doing substantially worse. They've been here on average 3, 4 years, many more. This is slightly higher among Ugandans and slightly higher among women. But then profits are quite similar for businesses at baseline between Ugandans and refugees. But again, quite small on average, about $28 US per month. That constitutes about 45% of the household earnings, to give you a sense of these households' well-being. It's quite different between men and women. Men have much higher profits, as is common in these settings. And then the mentors that we recruited have more than double the average profit. So we hope kind of have something to share in their kind of business experience and success. So the motivation of this project is to bring together groups that don't discuss business as much. And so at baseline, we ask people, who are your 3 closest contacts that you would ask for advice or be willing to partner with in business? And so you can see on the diagonal here that Ugandan men are most likely to list Ugandan men as their other contacts. So 74% of Ugandan men list at least one other Ugandan man in their contacts. Then as you go down, they're less likely to list Ugandan women, even less likely to list refugee men as they talk to, or refugee women. Then as you go over to the second column, Ugandan women are most likely to talk to Ugandan women, some Ugandan men, but then again, few refugees. Refugees sometimes talk to Ugandans within gender mostly, but you can see that most of these business networks are concentrated both within nationality and within gender. And so we think then that an intervention could be powerful to bring these groups together that may have information to exchange on techniques. The Congolese refugees are known for fabric that's quite popular in Kampala and may be able to share some of those ideas with Ugandans, and so that there could be this value information on suppliers, things like that could be valuable to bring people together is the overall idea behind the mentorship. So how do we do that exactly? Again, the mentorship groups are 3 mentees and 1 mentor that we've asked to meet weekly for 6 months. Within the mentorship group, we're also giving them this cash grant. So this is a $540 after 6 weeks, and then some money for transport to be able to meet their group members. Then across the group members and the mentors, some groups are same gender and same nationality. Other groups are mixed nationality, so there's 2 Ugandans and 2 Congolese or 2 Somalis, and then within the same gender. And then the third group composition that we have are mixed gender, so 2 men and 2 women within the same nationality. And so we're varying these compositions to see how exchange across them could be powerful for both business and social outcomes. We then do a lot to try to facilitate these groups, even though the mentors are leading them sort of from afar. So we provide videos and handbooks that has curriculum and discussion questions. And we have monthly meetings with the mentors at the IRC headquarters to discuss sort of how businesses are going and how the groups are going. And then we have a lottery that does, again, sort of individual level or group level payouts to incentivize people wanting to invest in their group members. So the group level lottery works that if your group member is eligible for the lottery, they're eligible if they have an open business. So you want your group member to be eligible for the lottery and invest in helping them open that business, because if they win the lottery, you also win the lottery and you get that same payout. So we're going to vary whether those incentives are at the group level or at the individual level. I'm not going to be able to talk much about those results today, but we think it's a cool feature that we'll expand more on in the paper. So then we've got another group that's just the cash only and then has this individual level lottery. So that's about 22% of the sample. And then a control group that's not going to get anything through the time of this data collection, but we've since gone back and given them the same cash grant for equity purposes. But the comparisons we're seeing here are before they've gotten that cash so that we can measure the effects. And so overall, about 60% of people are in mentorship, about 20% in cash, and about 20% in the control. All right, so the economic outcomes that we're looking at. So first, we're finding this large persistent impacts of cash on all groups. So first, monthly profits, we see a larger than 50% increase, so between the control group on the left and the cash group and the darker blue bars on the right. And then so these are just the averages within those groups across the 3, 6, 9, and 12-month follow-up. So you can see that we've got, on average, $30 more profit per micro-entrepreneur overall through each one of these measurements, so even sort of through 12 months on average. Capital increases, business ownership increases by about 15 percentage points. We see effects on psychosocial outcomes. So whether you're happy most of the time goes up. You see here that it's going sad, being sad most of the time goes down. Household earnings overall go up, so they're not substituting between sort of a business and something else. And then even like food security, we see that on average at baseline or in the control group, these households are missing 1 meal per 7 days, and we see that drops by about 0.3 meals in groups that get the cash. And these effects persist for men, not as much for women on the profit side, but the household well-being effect is still very strong after 12 months. So there's something sort of persistently happening with this large cash infusion. And what does mentorship do? So we're going to see on the left in the blue are the effects of the cash-only group, And the kind of height of that bar is the effect relative to the control group, okay? And so CAD 0 is at the bottom. That would be about the same as the control group. And so then the vertical axis is the amount, the size of that effect. And then the line is how the confidence interval and how noisy the data is. So you can see that the blue bars across each of these groups, Ugandans, refugees, men, and women, the blue squares are about the same height. So the effects are very similar across Ugandans and refugees and across men and women. Then when we look at the mentorship, we see that the red bars are about the same. There are no statistical differences on average between these mentorship groups in terms of profit effects. So then when we decompose the data between men and women, we see that any mentorship actually had a slight positive effect overall for men. The red square is higher than the blue square. And for women, you see that the red square is actually lower than the blue square. And so these mentorships seem to have a negative effect that really was not what we were expecting. So again, these people met in these groups. They reported attending 2.8 meetings per month while the program was still going, and seemed to actually be doing something within different groups here. What do we think is, well, some of the things we've been able to identify about where this is coming from. So the green now splitting out the mentorship groups between Ugandan mentors and refugee mentors. And so Ugandan mentors are in the red and refugee mentors are in the green. And so you can see that there's not a lot of difference between refugee mentors and Ugandan mentors in the left two panels. But then on the right two panels, the red is male mentors and the green is female mentors. And so you can see that for both men and for women, if they had a female mentor, that those effects are lower than if they had a male mentor. So men benefit from male mentorship. Women, unfortunately, don't seem to benefit much from male mentorship, but they seem to be harmed relative to just getting cash only compared to having a female mentor. So it's still positive with the $540 they got, still greater than zero, but not the effect we were expecting or hoping for. We can see that these effects are coming from the sort of largest businesses for the cash grants. You can see on the further right you go on each one of these graphs are sort of the more profitable businesses. And so the cash grants for both men and women really affected across the distribution, but especially as you get larger in this setting. But then mentorship, you see sort of slight positive effects for male mentors among men in sort of the middle of the distribution, but women, you can see that the negative effects come from the largest businesses. So female mentorship might have sort of curtailed business growth on the sort of highest end. We're still not totally sure why. And then again, we're really interested in networks here, and so but we actually don't see sort of too much action that we necessarily expected. So Ugandans, we don't see really any effect on expanding their business networks or the composition of those networks. Refugees, we see a little bit. We do see that men are expanding more, but it's from having cash and from expanding their businesses. That's sort of what they organically do even without the mentorship. And mentorship is even a little bit lower, if anything, whereas women, we don't see any expansion of these networks. So again, not exactly sort of what we expected. So now we'll move to the outcome, the social outcomes. We thought sort of bringing these groups together, testing the contact hypothesis would possibly yield sort of more understanding between different groups and more support for refugees among Ugandans. And so here I'm going to split the mentorship groups between the red are the mixed nationality groups. The groups that have 2 Ugandans and 2 other nationalities. And then the green are all of the other mentorship groups that are all Ugandans or all refugees. Okay, so there's no sort of intergroup contact there. And so what we see here is that for Ugandans, getting cash really changed. So the vertical axis, the effects that we're measuring here are an index of our social cohesion outcomes. So this includes things like, are you okay with having refugees as a neighbor, as a family member, and then donating to a refugee organization, things like that, and we're going to combine them all into an index. And so The blue bar here is the cash-only group again, and we have an effect among Ugandans from giving cash of 0.1 standard deviations, which we think is a pretty substantial amount. So this is significant at the 7% level. The 0 is the thick black line, and so it crosses that a little bit with the wide lines, but it's significant at a slightly higher level. And so we see that cash is really making the difference in terms of social cohesion outcomes, and mentorship, whether you're with another nationality and sort of spend time with this other group or not, is actually having a slightly lower effect. It's not different statistically, but clearly no evidence that this face time and spending time together has actually made a difference in terms of the views that people have, Ugandans or refugees, toward the other one. We see that this effect among Ugandans especially is really coming from women. That's the panel to the far right, that women have the strongest effect, and not much is happening among men, Ugandan men specifically. And the last outcome I'm going to show you is on policy views. So do Ugandans support refugees' right to work, support freedom of movement, and are they willing to accept more refugees? And again, this is measured in standard deviations, so not really interpretable, but we can see that sort of this overall measure that Ugandans who get just the cash only relative to control are really more strongly in favor of supporting refugees' right to work, supporting freedom of movement, willing to accept refugees. Refugees toward Ugandans, we don't see sort of the same effect, but we still think that this is a really exciting result. But again, not coming from those interactions or personal interactions. It's coming more from having the cash. So what do we think is going on here? Part of the launch event for this program, we included a message about where the assistance is coming from to make this really clear, especially to Ugandans. So part of that video and then the handbook that we give out says the IRC started the rebuild program because refugees live here in Kampala, and we want both refugees and Ugandans who live in Kampala to benefit. Refugees and Ugandans are participating in this program. In Uganda, more than 30% of foreign donations for refugees go to supporting Ugandans. So this is a Uganda policy overall, but a lot of NGOs, UNHCR is incorporating host communities into their work, but oftentimes host communities don't realize how they're benefiting from refugees, and they might think that the program is designed for Ugandans and that refugees are actually taking part of it, right? And so the argument that we're pitching here is that making it very clear that this assistance comes from the hosting of refugees is quite important. We think that's why the cash is really driving these positive effects among Ugandans. We have a lot of actually other evidence. This paper builds on our previous work in this setting and in others that teases apart just giving people cash versus giving people cash and giving them this script and explaining where the assistance comes from, that is because Ugandans are hosting refugees. And we see that people appreciate the cash, but when they get this cheap, easy label that goes with it, that then they're really able to say, okay, yes, we're now willing to host more refugees, even on social outcomes, that we see things changing and sort of more acceptance toward refugees when they feel like they're benefiting. And so we've done this across a number of different settings. So to wrap up here, in summary, we find really large, exciting effects on business, on household, and social cohesion outcomes that persist for the cash grants. This is similar across Ugandans and refugees, and we need more research that compares displaced and non-displaced populations. The mentorship is much more of a mixed bag, and that's especially frustrating because it costs an additional $350 to implement. And so for no return on average across that, especially for women that have lower returns in other settings, we were hoping to get much more bang for the buck. But maybe for men, maybe in certain contexts, there might be a different design that could deliver this. And again, no evidence that in this setting that intergroup contact really had these additional effects on top of getting the cash grants overall. I don't want to overgeneralize that result because I know we've got other exciting work. I think Mary Jo presenting right after me, and then Enrique on some positive sort of contact in other settings, in other sort of work. But in this setting, on top of the cash, we're not seeing it here, which kind of emphasizes the importance of research even sort of within specific contexts that we're working in. Thank you very much. Appreciate it.
Thanks so much, Thomas, and also indeed to your collaborators for presenting really such a complete and nuanced picture. I was asked by the organizers to make sure the session ends at 1. So as a result, I saw a hand go up already. I apologize. We'll note down your question, please, and we'll keep it to the end and bundle them across all presentations so that we can manage. You already queued it up beautifully for the next presentation in closing. So it's over to Maria Jose for the next one. Over to you.
Thank you very much. I'm just trying to share my screen.
We cannot hear you. I'm not sure whether that's an issue in the room or with your setup.
I am.
Now we can hear you. Please go ahead.
Yes?
Yes, all good. Please go ahead.
Okay, perfect. Thank you very much. So thank you all for having me today. Let me start by saying that I'm really, really sad to not be there in person to share the panel with you today.
Maria Jose, sorry to interrupt. We see your notes as opposed to the presentation.
Okay, let me...
So avoid the spoiler alerts. Yeah.
Let me share again.
Thank you.
Okay, I think.
Perfect. You're good to go.
Okay, thank you very much. And yes, my name is Maria Jose Silva-Vargas. I am a senior research and policy manager at JPAL Europe, as well as a postdoctoral researcher at Luxembourg Institute of Socioeconomic Research. And today I will present this paper co-authored with Francesco Loiacono at the EBRD, titled Contact in the Workplace and Social Cohesion, Experimental Evidence from Uganda. So what is the big motivation behind this research? I'm sure these figures will be discussed extensively over the coming days, but it is important to highlight that these are alarming facts. So nowadays we have 37.6 million of refugees worldwide, and 75% of them are hosted in low and middle income countries. Specifically for this research and for Thomas' research and other research in Uganda, Uganda hosts around 1.7 million of refugees, and this is the largest host country in Africa. So because of all these numbers or these facts, a lot of organizations, governments, and researchers, we wonder what type of policies could promote the socioeconomic integration of refugees. So we are thinking about economic integration for sure, but also social integration in the host communities. So our approach to answer this big question is to design a program in Uganda to integrate refugees in the labor market. So we used a randomized controlled trial where we randomly matched local firms with skilled refugee workers to answer 2 questions. The first one is if contact at the workplace can also foster social cohesion between local and refugee workers working at the same level. And the second question is, what is the impact of matchmaking refugee workers and native firms on firms' hiring decisions and attitudes in the future? So today we will just cover this part of the research. There is another paper that covers what I will call more the labor market outcomes of the research, but today we will focus on the social cohesion aspect. So the motivation of understanding social cohesion with a labor market program is because social cohesion is a key factor for growth and development, especially in countries with high levels of diversity. And we know that forced displacement can act as a shock and can disrupt and change some social relations in host countries. So that is why our program promotes social cohesion or tries to promote social cohesion in in this setting in Uganda, in a country with displaced populations, by fostering workplace contact at the same time. So I'm sure all of you know why contact could matter for social cohesion, but I will just give a little bit of a summary of the contact theory, which was written by Alport in 1954. And it says the idea behind the contact theory is that contact between different groups can reduce prejudice and discrimination under certain conditions. So there is experimental research that has shown already that contact in schools or living together in the same neighborhoods or doing sports together can promote social cohesion outcomes. But we also know from previous research that some adversarial contact can also have negative impact. So in our study, we try to provide also some evidence on what happens in namely the most important activity for adults, so working together. And we try to respect the conditions that Alport believed were important for contact. So in this case, workers have the same level, so they have equal status. There is no manager and worker, so they all do the same task. They also have institutional support, which is another condition, because we really work with firms that really wanted to hire refugees, and I will explain how we do that. And furthermore, these refugee and local workers, they work for a common goal because they do the same task, similar tasks, and they receive like the similar instructions from the manager. Another contribution that we try to give with this paper is that we measure social cohesion as a compound measure. So we do not only measure one thing and call it social cohesion, but we collected a lot of aspects that we believe are important for social cohesion. First of all, we focus on collecting biases, so implicit and explicit biases. And we also collect attitudes towards the outgroup and behaviors, real and hypothetical behaviors. And we do this for both the groups, so locals and refugees. We chose to run this RCT in Kampala and not in a refugee settlement in Uganda. As most of you know, Uganda has an open door policy and has a lot of settlements, but refugees can also live and work in the capital city. And we decided to focus there because it hosts refugees, and it also has 44% of all business establishments in the country. And almost 50% of all non-agricultural jobs are in Kampala. Furthermore, descriptive evidence from our pilot that we ran before the RCT shows that urban refugees are more educated and also more likely to look for jobs than rural refugees. Rurals are the refugees that live in the settlements. And finally, important for us is that comparing refugees with natives in Kampala, we see that refugees are more educated, but they are less employed and earn less. So to describe what we did, I want to describe a little bit the sample because we had some obstacles there that I think is important also for other research and programming in general. So to select the refugees, we work with two refugee-led NGOs, Yarid and Bondeco, that I know Thomas also has worked with. And then we collect a database of 1,088 skilled refugees that were either looking for jobs or were not in a permanent employment or were not actively looking for jobs, but were interested in applying for a potential job. From this, after we received the database, we set appointments to approach the respondents and ask them about the sectors they were interested in working in and explaining them the program. If they wanted to participate in the program, they were invited to take a test, a national test, to certify their skills. And this is mostly connected to the labor market paper. And we paid for the test, and they selected the sector they wanted to be tested in. And only 537 of the invited refugees passed the test or went to do the test. So this is something I can discuss more in the discussion, but we had some issues of take-up here. And the final sample of refugees was 377 because after they took the test, we needed to find a matched firm in the sector they were interested, but we couldn't find for some of these refugees. And for the selection of firms and local workers, we selected the firms that were in the same sectors the refugees were interested in working. And we did this by using the Ugandan census of establishments and doing a random walk in the areas we knew the sectors were located. And we recruited 1,196 firms. And in this case, we really wanted to work with firms that were really willing to hire refugees. And instead of just asking a yes or no question, we did a willingness to hire elicitation. And from this, 536 firms were really interested in hiring firms. And finally, the initial request to the initial condition to include the firm in the study was also that they had workers. But because we did this during COVID and after COVID, a lot of the firms lost the workers. So at the end, we had local workers within the firms that were 273. So our total sample for this study was 650 workers. So for the RCT, we randomly matched the refugees and the local workers to a control arm or to actually 2 treatments. I made a mistake in the slides. The first treatment was a direct work contact treatment. So in this group, refugees and local workers worked together directly for 1 week. This was facilitated through an internship that refugees were randomly offered, enabling them to engage with local workers and with the firm managers. The second treatment was what we call indirect work contact treatment. In this treatment, participants in the group, all of them, watch a video documentary showcasing a real scenario where a refugee and a local were actually working together in Kampala. And we filmed this in collaboration with Bondeco. And the video, I will not go in detail, but the video was not showcasing one of the sectors of the first treatment, and it was subtitled in all the languages that the participants wanted to see the video in. And the video can be found on YouTube if you're interested. For the analysis, we pull all the treatment together, especially for the final sample size that we had, and we refer to it as work contact, as you can see in the final graph of the RCT design. So for social cohesion outcomes, we first collect implicit bias using 2 implicit association tests, one that collected work bias and the second one that collected general bias. We did 2 IATs because our hypothesis was that the individuals could hold specific biases in certain areas. For instance, they could be biased towards work-related skills of the outgroup, but not on the general skills of the outgroup. And just to give a summary of the IATs, for some of you that might not know them, these are psychological tools that capture biases with categorization tasks. And how it works is that respondents see various stimuli or words on the screen. As you can see in the graph, you see hard working. And then respondents have to quickly sort the stimuli into 2 categories. So positive Ugandan, negative refugee. And these categories are also flipped in other rounds. So refugee positive, Ugandan negative, and they have to choose quickly. And the faster the respondent associates a stimulus with a group, the stronger the underlying bias. So, for example, if a person associates a refugee with negative more easily, they will respond faster. And then when the pair is flipped. And the final score is just a normalized difference between in response time, so in how fast you are, between this stereotypical and non-stereotypical grouping of the words. Let me just say here that in the psychological literature, there is a discussion regarding the IAT interpretation and validity. So there is a discussion about if this is a valid measure of prejudice, and also if this is a predictor of discriminatory behavior, because at the end, if you are measuring bias, but it's not connected to behavior, there is something that might not be as important as the implicit bias. And so we want to mention this here because our results show something interesting also on this matter. The second type of outcome that we collect is explicit stereotypes. So we ask the same stimuli or the same words shown in the IATs to the respondents, but instead we ask them to rank how they feel about this explicit stereotype with a Likert scale of 7-point Likert scale. We also collect attitudes, statements related to culture, trust, safety, marriage, job collaboration, and perceived discrimination. And these attitudes, we collected them through focus group discussions with refugees and local workers before the RCT to understand what attitudes matter for integration between different groups. And finally, we collect behaviors. One is a hypothetical behavior where we ask respondents how many businesses they would like to, how many business partners they would choose in a hypothetical business in Kampala, and afterwards, what will be the composition of between local and refugee. And then we also ask refugees to send an SMS to a specific number if they wanted to participate in a similar program, so in a similar internship in the future. And because there was the possibility of extending this sort of program after the RCT. And so just to jump to the results, we'll not show a lot of tables. I will just summarize a little bit what we find. First, we find that work contact decreases explicit bias among both groups, significantly decreases, while implicit bias increases for local. And so, as you can see here in the graph, the lines on the left are the ones that show explicit bias that decreases significantly for both groups, while implicit bias increases and is significant for local on the right side. At the same time, our second results show that behaviors improve. First of all, local workers are more willing to have partners, refugee business partners, in the hypothetical business scenario, with an effect that is around 42% of increase. And second, what we find that is quite interesting is that refugees are willing to work in a similar internship in the future, and the effect is quite high. It's a 90% increase over the mean. Specifically, they want to work with Ugandan firms, but not with refugee firms. So what we believe, just to have a discussion also on what it means that the implicit bias increases. First, it's important to know that an increase in implicit bias in this case does not translate to discriminatory behavior. In fact, we found some suggestive evidence that this rise in implicit bias is linked to concerns over job competition. So when we break down the implicit association test, you can see in the table, it's the only table I will show. In the second column, you can see that it's work implicit bias that is leading the significant effect and not the general implicit bias. Moreover, we remember that these refugee workers are highly skilled in the sectors they end up working in. And these skills are actually higher than what locals initially believed. In the graph in pink, you can see the initial beliefs of locals of how many months of experience the refugees had in the sector. And on the blue, dark blue, you can see the actual experience of refugees, which is almost double of the locals' initial belief. And also, locals' actual work experience is lower than the one of refugees. Also, importantly, even if there is a little increase in implicit bias, local workers are keen to work with refugee workers in the future due to the high level of skills. This is what we believe we find in this study. And On the side of the refugee workers, they are more interested in employed work, particularly in Ugandan firms, but they are less interested in starting businesses. And what we think it happens here is that there are a lot of micro-entrepreneurs between the refugee population in Kampala, but by offering them an internship, they learn that they can actually work within businesses in the city. So our conclusion is that work contact improves social cohesion, not only improves economic outcomes, but reducing explicit biases for both groups and encouraging positive behaviors. So local workers have positive behavior in the hypothetical business scenario, even with the increase in the implicit bias, and refugee workers have greater willingness, as we said, to work within Ugandan firms. About the measurement and interpretation of implicit bias, we see in this study that implicit and explicit biases are distinct. And this aligns with the socio-psychological literature, which posits that implicit and explicit biases are often unrelated. Notably, while the implicit bias tends to increase, explicit bias decreases, as we have seen in the graph. And additionally, the study offers evidence on the relationship between implicit bias and prejudice behavior, and we don't see that the increase in the implicit bias might not lead to these discriminatory actions. And this goes in line with some results that, for example, Alessina et al. In 2018, they found that math teachers in Italy, they had implicit bias and they did grade immigrant students less, but literature teachers, they didn't do that. So they didn't act upon their implicit biases. And finally, just some policy implications that we believe we can learn from this paper is, first of all, that this paper can also support the idea of enabling skilled refugees to access employment opportunities, not only for their economic outcomes, but also for their integration process, while boosting at the same socioeconomic prosperity of local business and creating maybe partnerships for the future for opening new businesses. Also, we support with this study open door policies, as Uganda is an open door, has an open door policy, and refugees can go and work in Kampala. And an important consideration that I mentioned at the beginning is to cover extra costs when running this type of programs, because indeed we have the lower take-up because refugees could not go and take the test and could not attend some of the internship. So that's it from me. Thank you very much. And if you have any question, please feel free to ask here or also send me an email. I'm super happy to interact online as well.
Thank you very much, Maria Jose. I hope you could hear the applause, faint at least through my microphone. Wonderful to have more evidence on this work contact and the dimensions that you unpacked. Really exciting. In order to give us time for some questions at the end, I will transition immediately over to Tara. Tara, please, the floor is yours.
Hi, everyone. I'll just start sharing my screen now. Okay, can you see the screen and hear me okay?
Yes and yes.
Great. Well, thank you very much, everyone. I'm really, really happy to be presenting with you. I'm very, very sorry not to be there in person, but very excited to present this new work that we have. So this is a project looking at supporting refugees and host communities in a fragile context. It's joint work with colleagues from the World Bank, Chloe Fernandez and Marcos Holmund, from another colleague, Andrea Guarizo, who's now based in Milan, and my colleague, Carol Newman, who's at Trinity College Dublin with me. So just for a bit of context, where we're working in Niger, and this is one of the poorest countries in the world. As we know, it faces many, many challenges. So about 40% or more than 40% of the population lives in extreme poverty. It's one of the countries most affected by climate change, so facing a lot of challenges there, and also has a history of violence and coup, the most recent one last year. But in addition to facing these kind of challenges in the local environment, it also hosts more than 800,000 refugees, IDPs, and asylum seekers. So this is just a huge challenge for a country to try to manage. And one of the challenges and one of the things that kind of motivates this project and this program is this concern that when we have such large numbers of displaced populations in an area that is itself very fragile and very underdeveloped, if we have a lot of humanitarian aid coming in directed at the groups that have been forcibly displaced, but you have host populations, local populations who are also greatly in need, then this delivery of humanitarian aid can potentially create tensions between these groups. So the idea behind the program that we look at in this project was both to focus on kind of the development side rather than just humanitarian aid. So to kind of have investment that's trying to encourage economic development, in particular, encouraging businesses. But importantly, that it is targeted both at the host population and at the displaced population. So this was a partnership between the government of Niger, the UNHCR, and the World Bank, and for this program, which we'll call PARCA. As I mentioned, it's an entrepreneurial support program. I'll give you a little bit of details about that, but it's really the main part of it is a substantial cash grant and some training, some entrepreneurship training. It was implemented in the very fragile areas of Niger within Diffa and Tillaberi. And importantly, as I mentioned, it's targeted at both the forcibly displaced and host populations. And the targeting for this program really had nothing to do with status as host or displaced. It was all based on economic status. So I'll explain a little bit the group that it's targeted at, but it is based on economic status, so level of poverty, and open to both populations. So this just gives you an idea of the areas in Niger where we were working. So the broader project, all of these villages that are in red were the kind of broader project, but our evaluation was happening in these areas in Diffa, down the bottom right, and over in Tillaberi as well, over here on the left. So these kind of very fragile areas that are often affected by conflict. So what do we do in our project, and why do we think we're making some contribution here? Well, we know that a large literature already exists that looks at the impact of cash transfer programs and enterprise support programs. So we're adding to that, but importantly, the context is very, very important. We're looking at this, a large-scale program implemented by the government in a very fragile, extremely low capacity setting, which has a very large number of forcibly displaced. So the context itself is something that's important. Can these programs that have been shown to work elsewhere still work in this type of setting, or are we in a world where the barriers to economic activity are just too high, and actually the more humanitarian support is more important? So that is kind of a question in and of itself. But then the important and the interesting part of this context, of course, is the interaction between the host population and the displaced. And we want to look in particular about the impact of this program on social cohesion, how it affects the relationship between these two groups. In addition, we're able to look then at the heterogeneous impacts of the program. Of course, these are also very different populations that have had different experiences, may have different levels of social capital available to them, and so this program may work in different ways. So we try to look at everything we do. I will present results for you that looks at the differential impact of the program for these two different groups within the population. And then finally, we believe there's very high potential for spillovers in this context. There's programs going into these villages, some people are receiving it, but everyone's interacting within the village. So we want to investigate spillovers here, and we do that in the paper, although I'm not going to talk because of time. I'm not going to talk about that a lot in this presentation. Okay, so because I'm conscious of the time and I actually have a very large amount of results that I may not get through all of them, I'm going to start by just giving you the key takeaways from what we've discovered so far, that you have those clear in your mind. The first thing that I want to mention is kind of an important caveat when interpreting these results, that we're looking at the short-run impacts of this program, and we can't really speak to the long-run impacts. I think it's interesting to see that there are significant impacts even in the short run. Very quickly, we're seeing effects of the program. But there was only about 3 months between the program implementation and when the end-line survey took place. So these results, and I think that's particularly important when we think about the results around social cohesion. We don't want to say necessarily, that these would always continue as this program continues, but certainly in the short run, there are some impacts. So firstly, on the economic side, the program is effective. Okay, we're seeing some meaningful improvements in economic outcomes, such as access to livestock, income, consumption. I'll show you some of those. Then we can say something about some differences. There are some differences, I think, that are interesting in terms of the kind of economic impacts of the program between the hosts and displaced. But importantly, both groups are benefiting from the program on the economic side. So it is beneficial for both populations. The third point then is moving to kind of the social outcomes. So we see a little bit of improvement in some reported levels of trust. So that's a kind of positive in social cohesion, in reported levels of trust in the community overall and in the different groups within the community. However, we do also see some negative impacts of the program on social cohesion in the short run. And in particular, which I think is kind of one of the key results, is that we see an increase in the reporting of disputes between hosts and displaced populations. Again, I'll dig into that if I have time, but we'll see that actually a lot of these, the disputes that we see reported the most are over resources that are needed for production, right? So things like access to land and water that may be scarce in this area, and that program may be, increasing the demand for these resources, is potentially leading to some disputes between these groups. In terms of the heterogeneous impacts on the social side, there are some important differences in the impacts of the program, and in particular, it seems to be the displaced population who are the ones reporting the more negative impacts. So some impacts that they're saying on reduced social capital and this increase in disputes and reduction in social cohesion. And then finally, the preliminary results that we have suggest that the program has very significant positive spillovers on non-treated households in treated villages. Again, I'm not going to go into those results here, but it's just important to see that actually the benefits of this program go far beyond just the beneficiaries, but is leading to increased economic activities in the treated villages in general. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the design of the program, so you have an idea of what we're talking about. So it was kind of a standard entrepreneurship support program, and there's two components. So there's a quite substantial cash grant of around $200, which in this context accounts for around 30% of GDP per capita. It's given to one household member, and that household member is nominated by the household. So one thing that is important to bear in mind in these results that I'll present to you are all at the household level. Because the household nominates the individual who receives the grant, we don't have that information in the control households of who would have been nominated. So we don't have at the individual level that control, we just have the household level, comparable households. So all of the results are at the household level. And then the second component is a training component. So there's a 5-day entrepreneurship business training program that aims to kind of provide support to this recipient to engage in some kind of economic activity and develop a business plan. So participants are required to attend the training. They have to present a business plan. After they do that, they receive the cash grant. But in principle, the cash is unconditional. There's no follow-up as to say you have to invest it in that business. And the program doesn't check on that. So in a way, you could think of the cash transfer as being unconditional, except for having the requirement of attending the training before receiving it. So in terms of the design of the study, this is a randomized controlled trial, and there's 2 levels of randomization, which is what allows us to capture the effect of spillovers. So initially, we had 238 villages that were included at the baseline, located across 11 communes. And when we chose these villages, we prioritized the villages that had, as much as possible, a mixed population of hosts and displaced. And then the villages were randomly allocated to treatment or control, just stratifying by commune. So within commune, having equal levels as much as possible, allocated between treatment and control, but done randomly. We lost some villages along the way. This is the challenge of working in a fragile context. So 68 villages were lost due to violence and implementation challenges along the way. So the final number that we have is 88 treatment villages and 82 control villages. But when we look at the baseline characteristics, we can say that we're well balanced, both in the original sample and in the sample after we lost some villages. So we do feel that the control villages that we have still represent an appropriate counterfactual for the treatment villages. Then there was some individual randomization as well. So within each village, all of the eligible households were identified. And importantly, this was done in the treatment villages and in the control villages. So we know who the eligible households are who might have received the program in the control villages. The whole village was mapped, and the individual households were classified into ultra poor, poor or non-poor. And it was the poor who were eligible for the program. They were the ones that seen as being most appropriate for this entrepreneurial support. There were other programs going on at the time for the ultra poor, but our study is just looking at this particular program. Then once all the eligible households have been identified, a public lottery is run to identify the actual beneficiaries. So on average, around 74 beneficiaries were selected in each treatment village, and this represents around 57% of the eligible population, which is about 40% of the treated village population. So this is one of the reasons why we think spillovers here are important, because quite a large share of the village is receiving this cash grant, and it's a substantial amount of money being injected into the village overall. Okay, so just to give an idea of our design, we have our treatment village. Here we have on the left, we have our control village, all of our eligible households. What we're comparing is treated households in treated villages, which is this kind of light brown color, with the control eligible households in the control villages. We're also able to look within villages at households that did not receive the program. And then by comparing households in treated villages and control villages, both eligible and ineligible, who did not receive the program, we can look at the spillover effect. Okay, I'm conscious of time, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on the baseline characteristics. We can see that in general, one of the main things just to highlight is that this variable as to whether any household member is internally displaced person or refugee, about 48 or to 48% of the households fall into that category. So that's what we're working with in terms of that proportion. Otherwise, I'm going to skip through these characteristics and move on to the outcomes so you get some of those takeaways. So first of all, I'm going to look at some economic outcomes. We have business outcomes, agriculture, expenditure, and food insecurity. And then for social outcomes, we look at trust, social capital, disputes, as I mentioned before. And then there's a couple of other variables as well that I may or may not have a chance to talk about. So let's just jump in here to look exactly at what's going on in terms of the economic outcomes. So this is kind of a summary here. These first couple of columns are looking at this kind of average standardized effect over all of our livelihood outcomes. So you can see in column 1 there, we're seeing a positive impact of the program overall. So this treatment effect is improving these economic livelihood outcomes by around 0.07 standard deviations overall on average. But the second column is giving this broken down, this kind of extra effect of whether or not there's a differential effect for the displaced population. And we can see that's not statistically significant there. So we're not seeing a big differential effect in the economic outcomes overall when we take them on average. We can also have a look here at what's happening with expenditure in these households, and you can see this positive effect on expenditure. So the columns 3 and 4 are looking at expenditure on kind of daily items in over the last 30 days, and we're seeing the program having increasing this by around 13%. In the next final 2 columns, this is on the kind of bigger expenditure over 3 months. So this is things like schooling and healthcare, weddings and ceremonies, things like that. We're not seeing the expenditure on those larger items changing much by the program yet, although given again the short run effect, maybe that's not overly surprising. In terms of where the money is going and the breakdown a little bit into these economic outcomes, you can see we're not actually seeing a big effect in reported self-employment and business. So there's only a fairly small share of the population that is reporting. Here, the control mean is showing us around 20% of people reporting having a business of their own. And there's not really much of an effect on the program here. So it doesn't seem to be seeing that we're seeing a lot of new business generation within this short run time period. But columns 3 and 4 are showing for households that have businesses, their profits are increasing. So we are seeing, so maybe that's what we would expect to see in the short run. Maybe it takes time to start up a new business, but for households that have businesses, their business profits are increasing. And again, we're seeing a fairly substantial increase here of about 30% increase in reported profits. Again, no major differential effect here between the host population and displaced. So both who have businesses are seeing an increase in profits. Then we move to the kind of agricultural side of things. We don't see a huge effect in access to agricultural land. The coefficient on the displaced interaction there is slightly negative, suggesting maybe a little bit of a worse effect for them. But the combined coefficient for them, which is these two coefficients added together, is not statistically significant. So we can't really say that there's any impact there. But there's some small indication, again, for those that do have access to land, that the amount of land that they're using is increasing. But access to livestock is really where we see the big effect in the short run. So here we are seeing now quite a substantial effect in the number of people who are reporting that they have access to livestock. So again, from the control mean here, we can see about 53% of people in the control are reporting access to livestock, and that's increasing by 10% overall if we take the overall sample, and this bigger increase even for the displaced. So here's where we start to see some of these differences. The displaced population, a stronger effect on them in getting access to livestock, and then also in columns 3 and 4, an increase in the number of livestock that they have. Again, strongly that effect being much stronger for the displaced than for the host population. Also positive reports in income, so in terms of an increase in reporting a positive income and an increase on the intensive margin for those who report positive income, an increase in income in the short run, again around the level of around 14% increase, so fairly substantial increases in the short run. I'm going to skip on to the social outcomes because I know I'm very short on time. So again, just in the aggregate here, this average effect, we're seeing an increase in reporting of trust. And that's again for host population and displaced population, some positive increase in the reporting of trust. But when we look at social capital, measures of social capital, which is things like how many people can you ask for help, how many people could you borrow money from, or would you be willing to lend money to, here is where we start to see the negative effects on the displaced. So there's a reduction here in this level of social capital that's being reported by the displaced who have received this program relative to the control. And then we have this increase in the reporting of disputes between hosts and refugees and hosts and IDPs. And again, here where we see some actually quite large results that are strongly being driven by the reporting from the displaced population. So a significant increase in the number of disputes that are reported. And here we can break that down. So we can see that what's driving this, one of the big effects is disputes over land. So where we see in the control mean, it's about 3% of people who are reporting being aware of disputes between hosts and refugees when it comes to land in the control. This is increases by 5 percentage points, which is very large relative to a mean of 3% overall. And this is being driven by the displaced who are reporting about a 10 percentage point increase in disputes over land. We see something similar in disputes over water, some increase in disputes and discrimination as well, and less so, but some still with other types of disputes, physical aggression and theft. And this is similar when we ask about disputes between hosts and IDPs. So I know that was a kind of whirlwind tour of some of our results, but I hope it gives you some kind of idea of what results are coming out of this. It's a short run effects, but we're finding positive economic impacts on both hosts and displaced, which suggests that scaling programs like this can provide rapid economic relief because it's even in the short run, and is even effective in these areas that are affected by fragility, conflict, and violence. However, it's important to be aware of these potential negative social impacts, especially maybe in this adjustment period to this large injection of capital in a very poor resource-constrained area. So it highlights this importance of being aware of this availability of other productive inputs. Maybe you are going to create some tension and competition to those inputs when you increase the demand for them in this area. So adding additional interventions to kind of mediate this could be very important. And then finally, just to be aware of some of the differential impacts between the host and population and displaced. And again, being aware of that when designing interventions, that maybe tailoring them slightly for these different groups could be important. I'll leave it there. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Tara, and I really appreciate you rushing through very rich content, and really interesting to see the impact on the economic level, but also in the context of scarcity and the importance of assets and livestock in the mix. We have a few minutes left to collect a few questions from the room. We had an early hand. I see another one in the back. We will take 3 questions. Do we have a roving mic? Yeah, we'll take 3 questions, and if you could just quickly say who you are and who you would like the question to be answered by. And in the meantime, with apologies to colleagues online, I suggest, since we have all your questions written down, we'll just come back to them separately after the time's up. Apologies in advance. So please, we were here in the front first. That was the first one, and then we go to the back and to the front again. Over to you.
Hello, I'm Anna Maria Maida from Georgetown University. Thank you very much for these presentations, very interesting work. My first question is specifically related to Thomas' presentation, but it's also about the other 2 presentations. And I was thinking about how to do mentorship. And based on my personal experience at university, it's very hard to mentor a person. And what I found is that the best way to mentor a person, for example, a PhD student doing research, is to work together. So I was wondering whether you thought about looking at mentorship within a work relationship. And I think that's important also because it aligns incentives of the mentor and the mentee. And I wonder whether your result on women is related to that. It's related to potential competition between the mentor and the mentee. And then it's a different question why you would find that for women and not for men. But I think there might be something related to that. And I also thought that Maria José's RCT may be able to look at the impact of mentorship in a work relationship if you have in the sample micro entrepreneurs who are employers. So I was wondering about whether you could look at that. Thank you.
Thanks so much. If you could just pass it all the way to the very back for the second question. Thank you.
My name is Basiru Shitu, and I'm a Dean of African School of Economics. My first intervention is just a suggestion for Tara. The audience, especially the non-technical, will benefit more if you have presented your regression result in terms of coefficient plot, like the previous one. Would be really interesting. But the technical question that I have for you is, how do you explain the negative impact about the dispute? Did you find any reason for that?
Wonderful.
Did that make any sense?
Thank you.
Did that make any sense?
We're getting nodding from Tara. Wonderful. Thank you for the question. And we have one last one in the front, and I'm afraid that's all we will have time for.
Thank you. My name is Sandra Rosso. I work at the research department. So quick question for Maria Jose. I think it's more a suggestion on your measures of behavior seem to be hypothetical. In a way, you're asking people, would you be willing to participate in the future? And so I wonder whether you have think about kind of following up with true measures of behavior, saying like implementing a program, seeing how much they participate, or there are like invitations to restaurants and in which they can, you know, go together, things like that. I think that might be a bit more effective measure. Thank you.
Wonderful, thanks. And Aisha, one bonus one for you. Who can deny Aisha?
Hi, thank you. And this is for Tara. Tara, I'm very familiar with this project because I was in Niger before. So I think there is one also because there was a sister program that was looking at, you know, the productive inclusion from the social safety net part that was providing cash transfer, for which we had actually some like unintended, you know, results, whereby when we provided cash, we saw that insecurity actually a little bit spiked, no, with the insurgents. That region is a little bit complicated. The other thing I wanted to ask, because this specific program was also looking at building community infrastructure. No, so maybe the question that I was, you know, it was building community infrastructure in addition to the, you know, the cash transfer, the, you know, the entrepreneurship and some others also, no? The question I had is just like when you were running those programs, where also you had, you know, some other investment, community infrastructure, schools, whatnot, right? Water harvesting and you know, small roads and so on. So I'll stop here. Thank you.
Great, thanks. Let's do these back to front in terms of the presenters lineup and start with Tara. Tara, you have two there for you. Over to you.
Great, thank you. And thank you for the feedback on the graphs. I think that's useful. I'll try to incorporate that for the future. So I think the first question was just asking about trying to understand, you know, why we're seeing the negative impact on disputes. Is that correct, if I understood correctly? So, I mean, I think what we're seeing, and it is kind of across the board on the different disputes, but I think we would think our interpretation is that it is this kind of competition, as was alluded to before, for these scarce resources. So you have a large injection of capital going in here. We can see it's mostly a lot of it being used towards agricultural production, but you have an environment potentially of scarce resources in terms of access. Everyone's trying to get access to these resources. I think one thing that's important to note here is that actually when we talk about disputes, and this is something for us to bear in mind, I think in future projects, our question was about disputes between host population and refugees, or host population and IDPs. Because that's what we were interested in, but we didn't actually ask about disputes overall, right? So we didn't ask about disputes between hosts and other hosts. And it's possible that actually that's what's going on, right? It's possible that just everyone in the village is just a little bit more competing for things, and that it's not specifically between those populations, but we're seeing it more, you know, there as well because of that. So that's something we have to think about and see if we can dig into the data a bit more to kind of separate that out. On the other question regarding the infrastructure project, yes, that's important. And that was ongoing in the background here, but it was in both the treatment and control villages. So basically the way the villages were identified was they were within a radius of wherever an infrastructure project was happening, the radius around that, all of the villages were potentially included in the sample. So that's kind of going on in the background, but because our project doesn't look at that and doesn't evaluate that. But because it's happening in both the treatment and control villages at the same time, it shouldn't really affect, you know, our interpretation of the results. It shouldn't be driving the results. I guess you could wonder about whether there's kind of complementarity there, I guess, in that making the program being more effective. But I'm not concerned about it kind of driving the results that we're seeing, because that's coming from the randomization. Also, they were targeted at the different groups. So that was the other program that I mentioned that was targeted at the poor, was this kind of work program on the infrastructures, whereas this program, that was targeted at the ultra poor. This program was targeted at the poor within the village. Thanks.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Tara. Maria Jose, we're coming back to you.
Yes, thank you very much. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
So on the question regarding if there are micro entrepreneurs in the sample, so because of how we selected the sample, refugees might not, there might be some micro-entrepreneurs, but not a lot, because we were selecting refugees that were skilled but did not have a job, or were looking for jobs, or were interested in applying but were not looking for jobs. So these are very specific sample, but I like the idea because indeed something happens when they work together that they want to work more together. So maybe there is some sort of yes, mentoring, maybe one mentors the other, maybe the local mentors the other, for sure. Like, this is something I will try to check in the data. And on the other questions regarding, from Sandra, regarding the behavioral outcomes, so it is true. So the way we are seeing this is that sending the SMS from the refugees is costly. So in a sense, they actually send the SMS to one of our field managers. And there was actually a program from the refugee-led NGO that was similar to what we did. So they were planning this program, and this was also to collect if they were interested in this program in the future. So in a sense, I understand the point that it can be seen as behavioral, but the program was actually, it was run after the RCT. So we still see that this can be like real behavior. The other one for sure is purely hypothetical, about working in a business with other partners. On other types of behavioral outcomes, we thought about it so much. It is true that our budget was super limited because we did 2 types of papers with the same program, but we thought about giving bushers to go to a restaurant together. And this is something we're still wondering if we want to follow up with the workers, because it's been almost 2 years, but this is something we're trying to think, but for sure, more behavioral outcomes will be like the focus. Thank you.
Thank you, Maria Jose. And we're back to the first question and presenter, Thomas.
Fantastic. Thank you. Ana Maria, thank you so much for the question. So we piloted, like, kind of trying to look at work relationships together, like starting businesses together and things like that. And that was just not going to work, but we can still sort of look at whether people are actually collaborating on direct business ventures after the fact. We don't really see that. We did see a few times in piloting where, mentors would bring their mentees along, and when their sectors sort of didn't interact, but they could sort of be complements to each other. So we just don't really pick that up in the data, and it's just not the way that this was designed, because people's sort of individual businesses were really where they were focused. But on the hypothesis that there could be a lot of competition between the mentors and mentees, so a couple thoughts there. First, we can do more to tease this out, and thanks a lot for the question. So we can think about sort of these groups are somewhat mixed across sectors. So like if there's a kind of pairing between the mentors or others sectors versus different sectors, do we see differential effects there? Could be driven by different things, but that's an interesting hypothesis. We also have the group level incentives that I talked about, that the results we're still going through those, but that could also, we were trying to get people to think that they're on the same team, right? That the payoffs to helping this person, even if they're in the same sector, to then, help their business move along so that they could possibly participate and get the payouts from the lottery, would overcome some of those things. So we can test at least on that intervention dimension, and we don't see any sort of aggregate effects that the bringing people together with the group lottery made any overall difference there. But then the last thing I'll say is we have one more round of surveys coming up. So your question, maybe think about sort of asking a few additional questions. So if anyone else has other, thoughts on, hypotheses like this, now is a great time that we can still ask follow-up questions. So really appreciate that. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Thomas, and a great way of saying let's continue the conversation. First of all, please join me in saying big thank you to all the presenters for the excellent content and their collaborators. And to all of you who didn't have a chance to get an answer to their question, we do have the chat. There was emails shared around. As always, these panels are just the beginning of an exchange, and I hope you make ample use of that. With that, thank you for joining this panel. I hand over the floor to Aisha quickly for some quick announcements. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Volker, for moderating this, and thank you to Thomas, Anna Maria, and our last presenter. So thank you so very much. You know, it's just a pity that we don't have in the room again some of the policymakers are still in the room. So some of those policy recommendations will very much resonate with them. So we are still very constrained in terms of time. We have a buffet that's outside. So would be very grateful if everyone could come back in the room at 1:45 to allow us to cover, some of the other additional academic session, but also an important panel to be moderated with my partner in crime sitting here. Bon appetit and see you later. Thank you.